Good evening. I'm Susan Reverby, and I have the privilege and sometimes a lot of the work to be the president of the Wellfleet non-resident taxpayers who are sponsoring this event this evening along with the Wellfleet Forum. We are also filming, videoing this evening's discussion and lecture part, and it will be available on Channel 18 if you get Channel 18, but it also will be on the town website. If you click on a button on the town website that says Video on Demand, and then go to the Wellfleet Community Forum, you will find this. So if any of your friends didn't make it tonight and want to know what's happening, that the filming will be available. I'd also like to urge those of you who are non-resident taxpayers and anybody else who would like to assist us to please think about joining the organization. Lyra is going to be sitting outside. Our dues are really, really one of the best deals in town, probably worth a dozen oysters somewhere. And please see Lyra and sign up, and then you'll get our newsletter and our e-blasts and information about what else we're doing. For those of you who have not been to one of our forums before, I'd like to remind you that the organization was started in 2000, so we're almost 20 years old now, and my joke is that we need a t-shirt that says taxation with a little bit of representation. We try to keep you apprised of what's happening in town. We now have a Facebook page. We're finally getting into the 21st century here. And we welcome your input on ideas for programs, things we should be covering, concerns that you have about the town. And my fellow board member, Ellen, reminds me that I should start with the joke that only a toxic bloom, which of course we did not cause, that went into Gull Pond this last few weeks is one of the reasons I think there's such an enormous turnout here tonight. But we're really happy to have you here, and we think this, obviously, the issue about the waters around Wellfleet are crucial. I'd like to remind you, and we've handed out this poster, that the next program will be on a Wednesday night. We usually do Thursday nights. It's going to be Wednesday, July 31st at Pres Hall, and we're calling this forum Home and Housing, Current and Future Issues, and it will feature Jerry Parent, who's the chair of the Planning Board, Bruce Catcher, who's here. Where's Bruce? Raise your hand so people know. Bruce is going to be there. He's a realtor in town. And Ellen McElroy, who many of you know as the former head of the library, but she's now the head of the Wellfleet Housing Authority. And they will be speaking on the issue of housing and home in Wellfleet. So on August 15th, and we'll be sending out notices about this, we have our annual State of the Town meeting, which will be held here. The select board members always come to this. This is a chance to raise with the select board members any of the issues you have about town governance, concerns about Wellfleet, and we welcome you to that event. The last thing I'm going to do before I introduce our speakers is our wonderful board member, Bob Sloan, in conjunction with Nauset High School, had a contest with the art students at Nauset to design a card that we could sell, and the proceeds of the card go to the art program at Nauset High School, and it's very cute. Bob and I got to pick the winner. It was really adorable. So for those who can't see this far, it's a little girl holding up an oyster shell. So if you're looking for cards to send, if you still don't do everything by text messaging or Facebook or Messenger, this is a really lovely way to remind people about things in Wellfleet, and you'll be supporting the art program at the high school. So tonight, we have three speakers. I'm going to introduce them, and then my colleague Ellen Rothman will be chairing the questions. We've asked the speakers to limit their time to 10 or 15 minutes, so there's lots of time for you. 20? 15 or 20, pardon me. 15 or 20 minutes, but there'll be time after they're all finished for you to ask any and all questions. We always leave a lot of time for questions. So let me just tell you who your speakers are for tonight. The first speaker is Sophia Fox. She is the aquatic ecologist at the Cape Cod National Seashore. Her job involves monitoring and research in the park's freshwater kettle ponds and estuarine ecosystems. Much of her work focuses on water quality issues and using field-collected data to understand changes that are occurring in response to human uses and climate change. Couldn't be more timely. Her research interest includes spatial couplings of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and the effects of human activities on those systems. She did her undergraduate degree at Wesleyan and received her MA and PhD in biology from the Boston University Marine Program in 2007, and she lives on Gull Pond. Our second speaker is Andrew Gottlieb, has been the executive director of the Association for the Preservation of Cape Cod since the spring of 2017. He has more than 30 years of environmental protection experience at all levels of government, having served as a local, state, and county official, as well as a legislative staff person. Before coming to the Organization for the Preservation of Cape Cod, he served for a decade as the executive director of the Cape Cod Water Protection Collaborative, which is charged with assisting towns and the regional government in a coordinated approach to water and wastewater management efforts. He holds a bachelor's and MBA degree from Harvard. A resident of Mashpee, he is serving his fourth term on the Mashpee Board of Selectmen. And then finally, my fellow and sister board member, Ellen Rothman, is filling in for Terry Smith from the Center for Coastal Studies, who had a scheduling conflict. A part-time resident of Wellfleet since 1963, Ellen is a member of our board. She trained as a historian, and she spent 8 years as the Chief of Interpretive Services for the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Management. She asked the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown to bring her up to date on what's going on in Cape Cod Bay and the west-facing Wellfleet shoreline. So without further ado, I welcome Sheila Fox to the podium. Thank you. Sophia, sorry.
It's a fun start. Let's see. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to talk for a few minutes. I told Ellen that due to recent events, I'm going to give a little more background than I was initially planning so that you guys have a better understanding of the ponds, and I assume that's why most of you are here tonight. So I've been at the seashore for 10 years as the aquatic ecologist there, and I've been doing a lot of work on our ponds in Wellfleet and Truro during that time, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that tonight. So first off, just to give you a sense of how common these are here, there are over 1,000 ponds on Cape Cod. This Cape Cod is a glacial outwash area, is the prime environment for these kettle ponds, and we are kind of a hot spot in the sort of world for these environments. And then you all know, let's zoom in on our ponds here in Wellfleet. We have a high concentration of them along our eastern coast, and many of us live along them for at least the summer season and longer. We know that they have abundant life at all scales, from the microscopic to the osprey. And so our interest is in all of these parts of the ecosystem. And one of the things that I'm going to focus a lot on tonight is the connections among the different parts of our landscape and how these pieces fit together. And so when we think of our ponds, we're not just focused on one part or one piece, but rather how it sits amongst all the parts of our landscape. And so if we think of our pond, we think of the waters, the plants, the animals, the mud, our homes, and even how we use them, fishing, recreating. And just for a little background of what they are and how they were formed as the glaciers receded from these areas, as large ice chunks were left along the landscape, and then these depressions in the landscape became filled as sea level rose and the groundwaters rose in the area, and they became the ponds as we know it today. And so they are constantly connected to the hydrologic system of Cape Cod. And with that connection, they feed the organisms, the microbes, the plants, the animals in these systems. As the groundwater is moving through these systems, it's bringing with it the nutrients that everything needs. We hear a lot about excessive nutrients, but these systems wouldn't be alive without these nutrients. So we do need them, and our groundwaters are bringing these nutrients into these systems. And so everything is connected. And then we can think of the connection of all the energy moving through the system. It starts from the sun, comes into our plants, moves into the plankton, our phytoplankton, and our zooplankton that are eating them, and then into the larger organisms that we're all familiar with seeing out there. And so we end up with a web of connections among all the different pieces, from the very small things to the very large. And in fact, I like this picture because it has a bald eagle. I had the opportunity recently to watch a bald eagle eat a trout on Gull Pond. Highlight of my life, really. And we don't sit just in Wellfleet. We're connected to the whole region through the atmosphere. And so that's something that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, is some of the research we're doing on these connections. So a little background on some of the changes we're seeing regionally. The surface of the Earth's temperature is increasing, and the area where we live is increasing at a rate that's higher than average. And so the northeastern U.S. is hotter and increasing faster than the rest of a lot of the U.S. And we do know that these temperature increases are likely the result of human-induced emissions, particularly carbon. And so what this is actually starting to look like more and more is that here we are in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is no longer looking like the climate of Massachusetts as we've known it, but it's looking more like, say, the climate of New York, and even more like New Jersey. And as we move through this century, in the next 50 years, we may even look more like South Carolina in terms of our climate. And so that's something that is really important to understand as we think about our ecosystems. And that figure is actually from the International Panel on Climate Change report from a few years ago. And so one of the things that we're very interested here are emissions in the atmosphere, emissions of sulfur oxides and nitrous oxides from power plants. And the Clean Air Act, implemented in 1990, and its amendments have had a significant impact on the pollution in the atmosphere of these compounds, and they've declined significantly over recent decades. So we were interested in knowing, well, that's nice, but what about Cape Cod? And so we've published several scientific papers looking at the responses of our lakes and ponds to these changes in the atmosphere. And we are fortunate at the National Seashore to have an air quality site where we're actually measuring these changes over time. And the site was established in the early 80s and has been running continuously since then, measuring these compounds that are coming down in rainfall. And so what we've seen, and this site is located in North Truro, and what we've seen is that there's been major changes in the compounds in rain falling from the atmosphere onto our watersheds and ponds, our landscape. Notably, the pH of the rain, the acidity of the rain, has decreased substantially. Something like a 30-fold decrease in acidity. And that's a result of the reduction of these pollution compounds that are highly acidic. The sulfur oxides have significantly declined, as well as the nitrous oxides in our rainfall. We also have long-term records of temperature, and what we've found is that we haven't actually seen much of a change in our summer and fall daytime temperatures and maximum temperatures, but what we've seen is there's been an increase in our minimum temperatures. So our nights are not as cool as they used to be. So we're not cooling down at night, so we're staying warmer longer. And so then we were wondering, okay, there are all these changes happening. What might the impact be on our ponds that we know are so connected to the landscape and this hydrological system of our groundwater, which is fed by rainfall? And so at the seashore, we have a long-term water quality monitoring program in our ponds that started in the 1970s in many of the ponds. And it provides a great opportunity to ask these questions and come up with some answers. It happens to be one of the longest freshwater monitoring, water quality monitoring programs in the country. So we're really excited to have this data set to be able to ask these questions about what is happening with all these changes that we have been able to measure. And so we go out on the ponds and we sample all different kinds of parameters like temperature, the oxygen in the waters, the pH, the acidity of the waters, how much light is penetrating through the water column, what are the nutrients, how much phytoplankton is out there, among many other things. And so back to how does this relate to what's going on in the rainfall, what we did was we looked at the pH of the waters in our ponds, and what we found was that they are mirroring exactly what's going on in the rainfall. So our ponds are becoming significantly less acidic than they have been, and that's primarily due to the Clean Air Act and cleaning up our atmosphere and reducing acid rain. And so we've measured that in our ponds where we've seen, again, this like 30-fold decrease in acidity. And we can measure that also in our sulfate and nitrous oxide measurements in the water of our ponds. So we're seeing this connection between what's going on in the atmosphere and Wellfleet ponds. And so you can kind of see the slopes of these lines are very similar. That's the that's the rainfall, pH, and then our ponds and the sulfur oxides and in the rainfall and then in the ponds. And so I always love presenting this figure, which is not from our research, but it was done by Marjorie Winkler a number of years ago, where she took a sediment core from Snow Pond in Truro. So she went out there, they put a big core down into the sediments, down about 80 centimeters. And if you do that, you can, the sediments are laid down over time, so you can actually date. And as you go deeper, you're going back in time. And so what they were looking at are the heavy metals in the sediments of Snow Pond. And again, these would be heavy metals that are not locally deposited, but instead deposited from the atmosphere. And some of the notable things that she found was that you can figure out what was the human use in the surrounding area, and not necessarily local to Cape Cod, but we might even be talking about the uses thousands of miles from here and that pollution being carried across the country and deposited here. And so they could see by the increase in metals in the sediments where the Industrial Revolution took place. And then they could see when you track lead, you could see when the automobile became popular. And then you can see when lead was removed from gasoline as well. And this is, again, in the sediments of Snow Pond and Truro. So our connection to the atmosphere and things that are going on potentially quite far from here is really profound. And so, as I presented earlier, we have seen that the air temperatures locally have been increasing. And so we know that temperature has a major impact on pond biology, physics, chemistry, and so we became really interested in what's going on there. And so we wanted to know, we know the air temperatures are increasing, what's happening in the pond waters? And so we took a look, we compared the air temperatures and the water temperatures, and what we found was they were absolutely directly related to one another. And these are about the water temperatures down to about a meter depth. So the top 3 feet of the pond are really closely connected to what's going on in the air. And then when we looked at the changes in the water temperatures over time, we also found that the pond water temperatures have been increasing considerably, even in the last 20 years, up to about 5 in some ponds, even like 7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is an average, so sometimes they're much warmer, and so that has major impacts on what might be going on with the biology, physics, and chemistry of the pond. So what are some of those impacts? So we know we've had changes in air temperature. There's a lot of predictions of changes in precipitation with climate change, drought, wetness, and how all of that might impact the pond. We know it will be altering the phytoplankton communities in our ponds. And we have hypothesized that it actually will increase the phytoplankton biomass in the change, and it will biomass in the ponds, and it will certainly change who are the players in that community. And that's where the cyanobacteria are coming in. The cyanobacteria are a natural part of the community of our ponds. But certain conditions allow them to be the dominant member of the community.
Can I ask you a question? Are any of those plants invasive?
We have very little problems with invasive plants in the seashore ponds.
We have a lot in New York.
Yep. And in other places across the Cape, it is a problem, but we have very few invasives. And so we predict that we will see, and we are already starting to see, some declines in water clarity and quality associated with this warming. And any changes that we see at the bottom of the food web in the plant communities, the phytoplankton, and even the shoreline vegetation, we are going to see those changes moving up the food web into the insects and other things that form the base of the food webs in our ponds. And we all know our ponds provide enjoyment to all of us, and they are experiencing significant human use impacts. And so that's something that I also spend a lot of time on. And some of the impacts that we've observed include shoreline erosion. This is primarily from people using the beaches and setting up their towels, and eventually the roots become exposed, and then they're no longer holding together the shoreline soils. In addition, this here is Long Pond. You can see people walking along the edges have removed all the vegetation. And then this is a shot from Gull Pond from above, and you can see from each of the homes there's a little trail through the vegetation. So our impacts are removing this vegetation, which has a protective purpose in these ponds, as well as an important ecosystem purpose. So we've got these higher temperatures, these interactions with human uses, and what else might we expect as we continue to increase our temperatures? one of the major features of our ponds are these formations of layers called stratification. And we go out and we measure stratification and we track it through the season. So we start our sampling early in the springtime, in March or April, before ponds have begun to stratify. And then we work all through the season, and we work until September, October, November, when they become mixed again. And that's a natural process for our ponds. But this process of warming the surface waters is really impacting that process. And so it's normal for our ponds to have a very warm surface layer, a very cold bottom layer, and this intermediate layer in the middle where these top and bottom layer interact. But what the consequences of this formation of stratification is that there's very low oxygen in the bottom waters of the ponds, and they become completely isolated from the surface where they have the potential to get oxygen from the air. And so the bottom waters become more anoxic, and those conditions can lead to release of nutrients. They can impact the organisms that require oxygen, among other impacts. And so we became interested in trying to understand what's happening with the pond stratification with these warming temperatures. And I'm just going to say that these graphs tell us a little bit about the strength of that stratification and how long it might last and how hard it is to break it. And so what we've found is that ponds are they have a much stronger stratification, which means the surface waters are much, much warmer than the cold bottom waters. And so the likelihood of them mixing and that oxygen being spread throughout the pond has decreased over time. And so we have longer periods of stratification, particularly into the fall. And so to sort of summarize what I've said, our pond ecosystems are very complex. They're closely connected to the landscape locally and regionally through the atmosphere. The plants and algae in our pond are absolutely essential components at the base of the food web, and they also perform a protective role, protecting the ponds from our uses on the watershed. And with climate change, we are already seeing substantial changes in the pond, but we predict them to continue to change, particularly in terms of our phytoplankton and our shoreline plant communities. These changes are also moving up the food web, and so we know that there are changes happening to all of the organisms in the pond. The warmer waters are leading to longer stratification. They're changing climate change in general is affecting the water levels of our ponds. We're seeing more shoreline erosion, and we are predicting more declines in water clarity as we move into the coming decades. And finally, these ponds are really critical natural resources for us. They're really abundant here within the seashore. They're really in the best condition around, and we are already seeing them changing in response to both the local and the more regional changes in the atmosphere. The monitoring research that we're doing and many others around the Cape are doing, including APCC, is really important for us to continue to understand and track what's going on in these resources. And the uses by humans are really exacerbating some of the impacts of warming temperatures and other impacts of climate change. So thank you very much.
I'm sorry, we're gonna have questions after all three, is that all right? Okay. Yeah, right?
Write them down.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, Andrew, do you want light? Thank you, Sophie. Because of connectivity.
So I'm supposed to talk about Wellfleet Harbor and the marine environment a little bit, but I'm going to try and pick up where Sophia left off. First, let me just say Association of Preserves Cape Cod is a nonprofit environmental advocacy and education organization. We've been working on the Cape for 51 years. We're a membership-based organization. I left these out on most of the chairs. Those of you who didn't get them, I left others strategically placed near the cookies. So if you get a cookie, you have to take one of these. You know, I know that a lot of you are seasonal. We're here 365 days a year working on these issues and trying to keep the Cape and Wellfleet communities similar to what it was when it attracted you here. So we would love to have you as a member and supporter, and at a minimum, we can share information with you on what's happening on the broader resources on Cape Cod. So one of the things, you know, because of the focus of the previous talk on climate impacts, the other huge driver of water quality changes in the freshwater environment, but also in the marine side, are nutrients. And as Sophia said, you know, nutrients are an important part of the system. They drive a healthy, balanced ecosystem that has adapted over tens of thousands of years on the Cape. And what we have done through a series of collective actions is put that balance out of whack. And we have over-fertilized, sort of the plant equivalent of overeating, the plant communities through human activity on the land side, through a couple of primary pathways. There's a certain amount of atmospheric deposition through rainfall of nutrients, nitrogen in particular as a byproduct of fossil fuel burning and transport through the atmosphere, but human waste disposal practices and fertilizer. A little bit from road runoff, you know, it can be significant in particular locations. So stormwater, human waste, fertilizers are driving significant changes in water resource quality in Wellfleet, everywhere else on Cape Cod. And you know, you hear about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. You hear about the pending cyanobacteria bloom in Lake Erie. It's happening everywhere, and that is one of the core threats to water quality that we're facing on Cape Cod. So on the freshwater side, phosphorus is largely the limiting nutrient. A lot of the phosphorus that comes into through your home, through products, cleaning fluids, detergents and the like, the phosphates have been banned by the state of Massachusetts for a number of years. There's a certain amount of phosphorus that comes through your septic system, a perfectly functioning septic system. You might have a brand new system, say, I'm not adding to the problem, my septic system is brand new, it works great. It does work great. Its purpose is singularly to keep bacteria away from human contact. It doesn't process nutrients, it doesn't by and large, take them out of the system, and it provides a direct source of introduction of nutrients and everything else that's in the effluent into the groundwater, where it ultimately flows to the nearest water body, whether it's a freshwater stream, a pond, or the coastal environment. The other thing is fertilizers, lawn fertilizers in particular, but also around gardens and the like. Our soil is very sandy, very permeable. Most of the native plants on the Cape are adapted to our lousy soils and nutrient-poor soils. They don't need a lot of fertilizers. If you want to grow it putting green, you have to fertilize it. A lot of that is going to end up, it washes through the soils, it washes off, and it ends up in the pond where it makes things grow, which is why you put it down. It's just not making what you want it to grow. It's making the things you don't want to grow, which is the algae in the freshwater systems and the saltwater systems. So, you know, if you go back and want to think a little bit about what can you do as a change in practice to do something, because some of what, especially what was described in the earlier talk, are global scale problems that we are consciously choosing not to deal with as a country right now. And that's a different talk. Did they know you were talking about that? But you can go home and just not fertilize your lawn. You don't need to, in all likelihood, if somebody's doing it for you, they're putting down more than you need because they don't get paid unless they're putting stuff down. The more you put down, the more you pay. Fertilizer is one of those things, a little bit may be good, a lot isn't better. But that tendency of people is to say, oh, I'm gonna green up my yard, I'm gonna put down a little bit more fertilizer. Well, now that we're getting 3, 4 inch, 5 inch rainstorms in 2 or 3 hours, I don't know about you, we had one last night over my house. That washes all those nutrients out of the system. And one of the reasons we're seeing, one of our theories of one of the reasons we're seeing cyanobacteria blooms, toxic blue-green algae blooms in lakes across the Cape that we're now starting to look at is because of relatively wet year and characterized by significant, heavy, short-term rain events that are flushing an enormous amount of nutrient load out of the watershed into the pond where it then feeds the blue-green algae and allows it to dominate. The fact that we're creating conditions by creating a warmer environment in which these bacteria initially evolved from and are really uniquely suited to thrive in gives them the two sets of conditions that they need to outcompete everything else. So it's really a matter of balance. On the marine side, in general, for Cape Cod, over the last 30 years, there's been a precipitous decline in nearshore marine water health and quality. It's worse on the south side. It's worse on the west side. So Buzzards Bay and the south-facing embayments are the worst. They're the worst for a couple of different reasons. The intensity of development is greater in those areas. It's the way the Cape developed for one reason or another. And those embayments are relatively large bodies of water, relatively shallow, low tidal exchange. You're used to what you're used to here on the south side. It's about 3 feet between high tide and low tide, and very narrow openings. So not a lot of water moves in and out of these embayments, and so all the nutrients that come through as a result of human activity, draining down from the watersheds, from basically Route 6 south, is a simple way to think about it, get put in those embayments and stays there, becomes bioavailable to the algae, and has basically causes large disruption in the system. As you move to the north side of the Cape, conditions are substantially better. Development is less intense. Tidal exchange is way more significant. So the openings to the embayments are much larger. So you have a lot more water going in and out. It's of higher quality in some instances. And so it gets further back up into the estuary, and water quality is pretty good. So Wellfleet Harbor, on a relative scale to most of the other marine waters in the Cape, is pretty good. It's not what it used to be. And it's not what it used to be, and it's trending in the wrong direction, as a general rule. The same physical dynamics that were described for the freshwater ponds apply equally to the marine side. It's warmer. It's warmer longer. The increase in nutrient and the plankton and the algae that it creates makes the water less clear. Those living matters absorb the more intense sunlight and the longer heat from load from the atmosphere and create a feedback loop that supports itself. And what it does is it makes the water warmer. And what happens when those algae die, even though the water may clear up, all that algae dies, it becomes a big compost pile on the bottom, and the nutrient load from those decaying plants sits in the sediments, and under certain atmospheric and weather conditions, resuspends back up and feeds that cycle again. So that's happening everywhere. It's happening here. It happens to a somewhat lesser degree than some of the other waters. But one of the things to think about and be aware of that's very different than the pond situations is that all these embayments are a series of smaller subsystems that people refer to as Wellfleet Harbor, Papaneset Bay in Miketown, 3 bays in Osterville, but they all have little components to them. As a general rule, the further up the embayment you get and further away from the opening, where there's a greater exchange colder, fresher water on a tide cycle, the worse the water quality gets, right? So it's very difficult and a little misleading to talk about water quality as measured at X point as being reflective of the conditions within the whole embayment. So it is very typical. I'll give you an example in my community, Papaneset Bay, which it's in my town. I consider it arguably the worst quality water on Cape Cod. Now, when we were evaluating measuring it, there's further up in the watershed, 2 freshwater rivers, the Mashpee and Santuit, that drain down to Papaneset Bay. They're just awful. And they're awful starting in April. Large algae mats, the water's brown, you can't see anything. It gets hot, it gets 91 degrees 2 summers ago on an outgoing low tide. And there's one station that's monitored for those 2 portions of the bay. There's another station out, a football throw away from the opening of the bay. You can see the bottom, it's relatively sandy, it's not mucky, it's not too bad. You blend those 2 things together, and we're doing a grading of the water quality of all the embayments on Cape Cod, and Papaneset Bay comes out like a C. Now, that's nothing to be proud of, but it's like, it's not that, but the sampling bias and where you're looking says a lot about how people perceive the water quality. So if you happen to have a house or you live or utilize the embayment at a location close to the outlet, you're probably experiencing relatively good water quality. If you live up, in this instance, up near Duck Creek, you might look at somebody who says water quality in the harbor is pretty good and go, what are you talking about? It's not what it was when I first came here. It's not what I was as a kid. I can't do what I used to do when I used the resource when I first came here. I can't find blue crabs. I can't, harvest shellfish. I can't do all things that I would tell you about my childhood in Mashpee that I can't do on any one of my water bodies in my community. And I'm not that old yet, all right? And things that my kids have no idea what I'm talking about. And it's a real problem of shifting baselines. My baseline of what I think about what the water quality look like is very different than my closest friend who's a Native American whose father grew up in the early 1900s doing what he was doing as a subsistence farmer, fisherman, shell fisherman in the Cape. His baseline no longer exists. It no longer existed when I established mine. Mine no longer exists when my 20-year-olds established theirs. And it's a real threat to what we are willing to fight for, because if the water quality that you're talking about wanting to restore to is really a poor quality, relatively poor quality given what should be here, it's hard to fight for what you never saw, what you never understood to be present. And it's a real challenge that we all face. Within the confines of sort of what we're doing, there are a variety of techniques that are available to communities to manage this problem in the marine side. And I will tell you it can be managed. And the reason I'll tell you it can be managed is, in my former life worked at the state environmental agencies at the time the Boston Harbor cleanup was taking place. So for those of you that want to go back to 1988, when President Reagan and Mike Dukakis, then the governor of Massachusetts, were contesting the election, or George Bush, I'm sorry, Boston Harbor was the worst urban harbor in America. The region invested $5 billion in a cleanup program implemented over a protracted period of time, 15, 20 years under a federal court order. You look at what's going on in Boston Harbor now in terms of the water quality, there are significant portions of that urban harbor that are superior water quality to what we have in large parts of Cape Cod. Think about that for a minute. And if you look at what the city of Boston has done, having turned its back on the waterfront for several decades as a result of the pollution, and what's happened in Boston in terms of economic development opportunities, and what's that driving in terms of job creation and housing opportunities, really good investment opportunities, and that's a whole other topic as well. simply dealing with the source of the contamination, which was grossly undertreated sewage that was treated at a sewage treatment plant, and then the remnants, the sludge, dumped back into the harbor. That's what we did for 50 years in Massachusetts. If you look at how that harbor has turned around, it provides, I think, a cause for some hope and expectation that if we as a broader community on the Cape begin to deal with this issue, we can turn around trends that are driving water quality in a way that nobody's happy with. It doesn't mean that everybody on Cape Cod needs to be connected to a sewer. Some of us do. What you do as a community at the end of the day is ultimately your choice. There are 15 communities on Cape Cod pursuing, not 15, 25 different solutions. Sometimes working with one another, sometimes working against one another, sometimes kind of treading water, hoping it all goes away, which it won't. But you're allowed to, and are encouraged to under the system that exists now, to utilize alternative approaches and alternative technologies to conventional sewering where they are appropriate and reasonably expected to solve your problem. They are not, and I have not seen in my experience, one single alternative technological approach that provides a community-wide silver bullet, single solution, faster, better, cheaper than the conventional treatment and collection alternatives. They are a part of an integrated strategy, the balance of which is really a function of your local conditions within your community, your willingness to spend money, your willingness to assume risk, and at the end of the day, your acceptance of the fact that in the event that your alternatives don't work the way you want them to, the fallback is you got to sewer it. So there are options. A number of communities, you among them, are looking at different alternative approaches. Some involve shellfish. My community, Mashpee, we've made a big bet on shellfish, but we're also building, at a minimum, 2 treatment plants and sewering half our community at significant additional cost. And that's the picture that I see happening in communities across the region. Some mix. There's only one town on the Cape, the town Chatham, that's chosen to address its water quality issue on a sewer everything approach for a variety of different reasons, not all of which driven by water quality, and also driven by the fact that their economic demographic is unlike that which any one of the other 14 of us have. Even they have backed away from that program and are beginning to look at sharing their facility and the capacity that their facility provides with adjoining communities, in particular the town of Harwich, both because it's a more cost-effective way to address the water quality problem that they're confronting, because the light bulb went off. It's like, hey, if we can get the taxpayers of the town of Harwich to pay for a chunk of this system, then we don't have to ask for it from our taxpayers, and generally that's a winning vote strategy. So people have begun to get into thinking about things that way. A couple other things I want to think of for you to think about. The demographics of the Cape have changed markedly in the last 30 years. And by that I mean, if you look at the summer peaking factor, in the 1980s, the Cape, and there's variability across communities, but as a whole, our summer peak was 3 times our year-round population. Now it's twice. The reason for that is twice. 3 times. In the summer in the 80s, there were 3 times as many people on the Cape writ large as there were in the winter. Now there's double the amount of people. So what does that mean? It means that there's been a significant conversion of seasonal homes to year-round. Not just new homes being built. New development pressures are real, but you've seen a significant conversion. I mean, I'm a good example. So, summer house built in 1961, used it as a summer home for years, decided, hey, this is nice, brought my family down. So a house that was a 5-6 month home is now a 12-month-a-year home. So that has changed what the Cape looks like from a variety of perspectives, from a nutrient and wastewater management perspective, and what your pond is seeing and what your estuaries are seeing. You're seeing higher loads from a given home entering the groundwater and impacting your resources than you used to. And nobody has any control whatsoever on a municipal government level on home conversions. I didn't need a permit to come live in my house for a longer period of time than I used to, nor should I have, arguably. But it has multiplied across the entire region, a really significant impact on the loads that we're dealing with and trying to manage. Has other impacts on water use, traffic, jobs, services, and all that, but it has a big impact on that. The other thing that's changed markedly since 2007 is the second home market. One of the unrecognized impacts of the recession of 2007 was a conversion of an enormous amount of our year-round housing stock to rental and investment property. It's a transition that happened in 7, 8, and 9, and has not abated. And in fact, it has been exacerbated by the new trend towards, for short language, the Airbnb phenomenon, where it has become easier and very lucrative to rent your home on a short-term basis, even a nightly basis, in a way that has taken both a lot of housing out of the market, and has had some real distortive effects on the housing market on Cape Cod, and has really put upward pressure on rents, and created a very difficult situation for year-round residents looking to rent, not own. But in addition, the intensity of use that tends to come along with these seasonal rentals, again, on the wastewater loading part, is radically different than what happens when it's just you in your home with your family. So we had a home built across the street from our office in Dennis on Route 6A last year that went right on Airbnb. First Friday of July, I was getting ready to leave. I looked across the street. There were 10 cars in the parking lot, in the driveway. So, you get the septic load, the water use load from 15 to 18 people in a single family home, as opposed to 4 or 5 with a typical family. They all arrive not in 1 or 2 cars like a family does, but in 7, 8, and 9 cars. If you think the traffic's worse, it is. And that's just not a small part of the reason why. So there's a lot of trends going on that are really hard to manage and think about, but they all have an impact on what we do and the strategies that as a community we choose to implement, because certain things rely on changes in personal behavior, and if people are shuttling in and out of the house, it's really hard to manage them. So it might lead you to a more technological approach that kind of runs on its own in the background, or an alternative that runs on its own in the background, as opposed to relying on the commitment that an educated person who knows the resources, knows what to affect, would otherwise do. So I'll wrap up by just saying we're at I think, crossroads period as a set of communities where we have to make some real choices about what we want our resources to look like. They are degraded heavily from what they used to be. Most, if not all of them, can be restored to a large degree, but it's going to take some care and maintenance on our part to make that happen, and it's going to involve everybody in the community. So thank you for your time.
Okay, some of what I have is repetitive, and I'll skip that so we can get to the questions. I do have to say, I told Susan that my mother used to say, if you get a good liberal arts education, TBA shouldn't scare you a bit. So I am not a marine scientist. I'm a liberal arts graduate with a advanced degree in history, but I know Wellfleet very well and care a lot about it. So with the help of the folks at the Center for Coastal Studies, I pulled together what I think are kind of the high points in terms of the bay, which, if you're like me and you've spent so much of your time on the ocean side, and you go down to Max and get ice cream and watch the sunset and look at the harbor, and there don't seem to be as many boats at the pier as when I was a little kid. But I was the one who really insisted that we include it tonight when we talked about Wellfleet waters. I am going to change the order of what I was going to say a little bit so I can piggyback on Andrew about water quality. The Center for Coastal Studies monitors the water quality. They have 10 stations in and around Wellfleet and 12 stations in Cape Cod Bay. This is part of the Cape Cod Water Quality Monitoring Program that Andrew is involved in, his organization is involved in. The Wellfleet stations are sampled once every 2 weeks from May to October, once a week in February, once in February. The Cape Cod Bay stations are monitored once a month year-round. But Andrew has just showed us that where you put your monitoring station, it's like a snapshot of a corner of the room, and it might be the corner in which something is happening or not, and then this data all gets averaged out, and so it's not quite as precise as you might think. But again, as Andrew said, this all goes into something called the Health Index, which was developed by the Buzzards Bay Coalition, and now you know why. The Buzzards Bay Coalition would have been moved to do this. And they look at nitrogen loading, but also inorganic compounds and water quality, et cetera. And they do these logarithmic equations, which I would not pretend to understand. But it does show, interestingly, Graham Geis at the Center for Coastal Studies sent me an email today. By the way, the 2 years that the Wellfleet Oyster Project, it has a name, we did see some improvement in water quality in the Inner Harbor during the years that the town was involved in the Oyster Project, 2012 to 2014, where mulch was put down in that area to encourage settlement, propagation, and growth of oysters in the area. So there was some improvement. But in general, as Andrew said, the water quality, the decline in Wellfleet, it's not as precipitous. I don't think we're quite where Mashpee is, but that's the direction. So our water quality, you may be wondering about plastic, which hasn't been mentioned, but is an issue in water quality. And there's land-based pollution and water-based, again, as Andrew has said. And the porous nature of the soil that we have here means that you put, and I have this constant argument when I'm at a pond, I can only imagine how you might react. But when I see people with their dogs, 3 or 4 dogs, and they tell, oh, my dog doesn't poop in the pond and everything. And I'm just thinking about how porous the soil is around the ponds. And I always say to them, we drink this water. No, we don't. You know, anyway, you get the idea if you've spent time here. But it's human waste. Nobody's mentioned canine waste. It's not a popular subject, but that too. And failing septic systems, and then every kind of plastic you can imagine. The fishing industry is a heavy user of plastics. The lobster traps, they may look like wood, but they're all held together with all this plastic stuff, and every time there's a storm, especially in the winter, come down here after a nor'easter, and the amount of plastic on the beach and in the water, not at the ponds, but in the harbor, in the bay, and on the ocean side is huge, which is why the beach cleanups and they quantify what they find, and they find a lot. So and some of it comes from very far away, and some of it comes from PJ. So we all we've all had the balloon discussion with our children and grandchildren. balloons are so much fun, so why are you against balloons? Okay, so let me just talk for a few minutes about the other issue besides water quality, which I think really comes into play on the bay side. I would have said until a year ago, little less than a year ago, that erosion was probably the number one concern. And now we know that it's not erosion, it's sharks, stupid, you know. I mean, it's like the economy, it's sharks. The sharks are a threat to the economy. And they may be part of a very healthy ecosystem, but whether they can be part of a healthy, sustainable tourist economy remains to be seen. We now know that they are in the bay. We used to say, no, it's in the ocean. It's fine in the bay. It's not. It's fine in the bay. They belong in the bay too. The bay it's their habitat. They're there. Greg Scommel, who couldn't be with us tonight, our chief state scientist, shark scientist, I think he's already tagged 11 sharks just in the Wellfleet part of Cape Cod Bay this year. There's just a lot of them out there. Are they in as close as they are on the ocean side? The evidence isn't in yet, probably not, but that's behavior. What he's trying to do is study their behavior and study their relationship to the seals, the predator-prey relationship, so he can better tell us what to do to be safe. So if we leave, we're not here to talk about sharks, although we may, have a lot of questions that we can't answer, and even he can't answer, which is why he's out doing research right this very minute, I'm sure. But in terms of the next thing on the list, erosion, we know a lot more. There is again, it used to be seen as, oh, that's on the ocean side. Well, it's on the bay side too. And those of you who own property or spend a lot of time on the bay side in certain parts of the west-facing Wellfleet shoreline are very aware of this. And we have a couple of we have the inner shoreline, which are the marshes and the estuaries that are protected from the wave action that causes erosion. But interestingly, and I learned this from the Center for Coastal Studies, through the process of submergence by rising sea level, Wellfleet loses about an acre of coastal upland a year. Now, if you took an acre out of one subdivision, it would seem like a lot, but of course it's spread over a really large area. So it doesn't seem like that much, but it's an ongoing process. Now, on the outer shoreline, picture us like this. So the outer shoreline would be where you can see Provincetown and and Plymouth off the other way. That doesn't add up to more than an acre a year, but a huge amount of sand and gravel is moved around. And the place where the northwesterly prevailing winter wind and the southwesterly prevailing summer wind come together is on the bay side between Duck Harbor and Great Island. So if any of you remember back in the 70s when the town used a little bit of money and fixed up Sunset Hill up there where the park has the parking lot for the Great Island Walk, and we'd go up there and you could see the sunset. Well, you can't see the sunset now because the trees have grown up. There's no real way to access that beach, but apparently there's a fair amount of erosion there because that's where the winds and, of course, the waves the wave action, that's where it sort of pinches, if you think about it. And the long-term erosion rate is about 2 to 3 feet a year, which is what the long-term erosion rate has been on the ocean side, too. So that surprised me a little bit because I haven't been on that part of the bayfront in a while, but I'm going to walk out there. So it's also true that the north facing coast of Lieutenant Island is retreating fairly rapidly at several locations. And I have walked out there and you can see it. Now, you also will see some riprap and groins and hardening that people have done. And then you see other places where they haven't. And today I talked to Hillary Greenberg, the health and conservation agent, and she clarified for me that if you have an erosion problem on the ocean side, forget it. Okay? I happen to have a major erosion problem, and the answer is going to be the landfill. But if you have an erosion problem on the bay side, there may be something to be done to slow it down. The Conservation Commission evaluates and issues permits on a case-by-case basis. It is not a hard and fast rule that says we do not permit revetments. Under state law, if your house was built before 1978, you have a better chance of making a case to harden your shoreline than if your house was built after 1978. But even after 1978, the Conservation Commission, this all has to be permitted, obviously, will sometimes allow beach nourishment, and sometimes they're doing some new things out on Lieutenant Island where they're going to build a little marsh, which is called a soft way of, instead of hardening it with all those big rocks, which then starve the beach upward or down from it, this is a new, again, Andrew talked about new technologies, new approaches. So if you have an erosion problem, don't assume you will be permitted or you won't be. Go to the Conservation Commission and make your application. If you want to know what's happening with the big house, which has an erosion problem, about which we're all very sympathetic, they applied for a permit. Do you all know what I'm talking about? Okay. They applied for a permit to do a revetment because they've got a serious erosion problem. And if you think about what I just said about the worst erosion on our bayfront happening between Duck Harbor and Great Island, where is that house? Right there. And the Concom said no. It was denied. Don't get too excited. It was denied. This is all up on the website if you want to see it. It's not all, but that part is on the website in the Conservation Commission page. However, the property owners, within their rights, are appealing and are taking the case to Superior Court. The town will fight it. You know, make your wagers as you will. There probably won't be any decision. It'll probably take another 5 or 6 months before there's a decision. So that's the erosion story on the bay side, and I'm not gonna talk really much about water quality because both Sophia and Andrew did such a good job of doing that. I will tell you, this was something that I found interesting. If I'd had to guess, I don't think I would have come close. This is a Park Service study there are, out of 98 species, that seems like a lot, doesn't it? There are 98 species in Wellfleet Harbor. And they're, well, species of marine life. And there are 9,800, I don't know how they came up with this number. It's amazing. It's probably made up, but anyway, 9,838, maybe, Sophia, how do you get a number like that? 9,838 individuals. What, they send a bunch of interns out there to count every fish and clam and, yeah, okay. The Park Service is amazing what they can, they're amazing what they do. So they've got one species, I can't even pronounce it, but it's cryptogenic, which means the origin is unknown. One species. So apparently that's big. But it is interesting, these 31 species, 95% of all the individuals that they counted somehow fall into 31 invertebrate species, which means there's not actually, although there are 98 total species in Wellfleet Harbor, there's not actually all that much biological diversity there. There's probably the right amount for what can be sustained. And I don't know, I'd love to know if that line is going like this, because from everything we've heard about water quality, temperature, climate change, it seems at least, if not likely, then possible that the biodiversity may be in decline, and Sophia may know if that's true or not. I'm just speculating. So we will now take questions, and I will take the liberty of asking the first question, which I suspect is on a lot of people's minds here, which is to our pond doctor, which is why, if this bacteria is part of the ecosystem of the pond, why, when it's found, what danger does it pose, and why did the pond have to be closed to swimming? And there's a mic right there, Sophia. Mia, is that right? Where'd she go? Yes?
Can everybody hear me? It's not a bacteria, it's an algae.
Okay.
And it is a natural part of the community, and as Andrew talked about, with nutrients and the right conditions, these algae are able to multiply very quickly and form what we call blooms, which would be a large proliferation of these really microscopic organisms. They're so numerous that they become visible. And what we find with cyanobacteria in particular is that when they develop into this growth proliferation state, that they begin producing toxins that are harmful to people, pets, and the organisms in the ecosystems where they are. And so those are the things that we're concerned about from a public health point of view. The pond was closed when we observed a bloom, and that it was closed as a precaution while testing was undertaken.
So it's not the organism itself, it's what it produces.
Correct.
Yes.
Because of global warming and that picture of Massachusetts.
Can you stand up? We have a mic.
Sorry, I'll speak.
You speak.
The global warming and the picture of Massachusetts going south. Can you give us a sense, both of you, about how regulations should change with respect to the fact that we do have this global situation? So I would have thought, for example, there's an equilibrium that used to be with temperature and the nitrogen runoff. Now that's changed because the temperature is higher. So,
I'll give the federal employee a break in explaining what regulatory regimes need to be done to deal with climate change.
I meant locally, I know we can't change.
Locally, you know, you can, well, as a matter of regulatory policy, the town has a series of imperfect tools available to it to deal with the nitrogen and phosphorus from septic systems. At the end of the day, much of the regulatory world was set up around, in 1972 in the Federal Clean Water Act, around industrial pipes pollution sources, where you had the mill, the factory, the sewage treatment plant belching large quantities of waste into the water. You could find the location, you could enforce against them, and you could improve it. The problem we have with septic systems, because 4 towns on Cape Cod treat the waste from 3% of the parcels on Cape Cod with municipal sewage service, is that it's every single one of us who owns a home with a septic system in our backyard who are the source of the problem. And there is no technologically available backyard treatment system that allows you to get your wastewater loading levels down to the point where it won't impact water quality. There is no solution available to me or you as a homeowner that I can put in my backyard that solves the problem, which is why towns need to, A, get in the wastewater collection and treatment business, and B, deal with alternative technologies where they're appropriate, whether it's alternative septic systems which bring the nitrogen levels down but not to the level they need to be down, or other approaches, reactive barriers, shellfishing at certain locations, wetland modification, restoration, and the like, natural systems restoration. So it calls for a collective approach by the town, Wellfleet and the 14 other towns on the Cape, to create a publicly managed solution to this problem, because you can't beat the individuals down hard enough, to be frank. They don't have the ability to do it, and there isn't the technology to do it. So there's that. And then, on the regulatory side, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in its infinite wisdom, gave the state preemptory authority over the local control of pesticides and fertilizers. So towns had a small window. 8 of the 15 towns on the Cape, about 6 years ago, passed local bylaws regulating when you can put fertilizers down. You can have a whole separate argument about how well it's enforced, so how meaningful it is. But the 7 that didn't can't anymore. It's a state regulatory thing. The state regulatory side is not as good as it should be on chemical fertilizers because of the influence, frankly, of the agricultural interest and the lawn care industry in working with the Department of Agricultural Resources. So I don't know off the top of my head whether Wellfleet did a local control bylaw. Even if you did, the amount of fertilizer you're allowed to do under most local bylaws is more than you need. So I would urge all of you to take it on yourselves to back off of it. If you live on the pond, you live on the bay, really back off of it. And if you're going to use it, use organic fertilizers. They have less of a half-life than the chemical fertilizers do. Don't put them down when it's going to rain within 48 hours. More isn't better. Change the mix of what you have in your yard to go back to native species that don't need or expect or even want the fertilization. You'll save money on fertilizer. You'll have happy plants, you'll have happy butterflies, you'll have happy birds, you'll have happy insects. And you can make a big difference. But the meat of this is really the towns collectively, and I'm not singling out Wellfleet. I was here 2 days ago talking to a bunch of the same people in this room about what you're doing on the planning side. But collectively, towns need to accept their responsibility to deal with their wastewater problem, and they're going to ask you to pay for it. And I would suggest that that is a less expensive and better alternative than the do-nothing approach, because the do-nothing approach is headed where you see your water quality going, and your property values will suffer far greater damage from poor water quality than they will from the improved water quality and the tax bill that comes along with paying for that.
Question back here.
Okay, I'm going to take this. Is this about wastewater?
It's about the ponds.
Okay, hang on one second.
Fertilizer, what part of fertilizer, what chemical in fertilizer creates algae?
The question was, what part of fertilizers creates the algae? It's the phosphorus in the fresh water, nitrogen in the salt water. So just look at the bag. Look at the numbers on the bag. One's phosphorus, one nitrogen, and one's something else.
And we'll go to you in a
Potassium.
second, and I want to give Sophia a chance, but I also want to say, if you look in your town report or on the website, you'll see there's a whole wastewater, I forget what it's called, the wastewater management committee or something. And I used to see that, and I used to think, what do we need that for? Well, Andrew's just told you what we need that for, and those are volunteers. I mean, like the planning board, it's just but it's a really important, and as Andrew said, we're taxpayers, it's gonna cost money.
For golf, do we know which, between pesticides, fertilizer, and septic systems is the greatest contributor, or are they pretty much equal?
Marine environment in general, 85% of the controllable nitrogen load is septic.
I would say it's the same for ponds.
Same for ponds. Okay, in the orange sweatshirt, we've got time for two more questions.
We've got a mic question over here.
Well, wait, I said he would be next, and then you, and then we'll take one more.
Here you go.
My question is to Sophia. Having been associated with Long Pond for over 50 years, I've noticed in the last 4 an increase in geese. Okay, and if, if, as Phyllis mentioned, we worry about dog dew, a geese averages 12 offspring per clutch. That's 12 more floating around. I want to know if there, since the geese have come, has the National Park Service done a quality water testing as a result of the increase in geese population? And then I have a second question after you answer that one.
Okay, so.
Very short.
So yes, we are aware of the increase in geese on Long Pond. I just learned tonight that actually there are several nests. We thought there was one. We actually were out on Gull Pond this week, sort of investigating where they were and what they were doing. And they have certainly had an impact on the vegetation as well, which is what they're feeding on. So it is something that we are looking into, and there are a lot of feces in the water. Back to what Andrew was saying about sampling, we sample at 2 locations in Long Pond, and they're in the deepest parts of the pond, so we don't sample much along the edges and where you would see the major impact. And so in the locations where we sample, we have not seen change.
I wear this orange shirt because my grandson, middle grandson, is a leukemia victim, okay? And so he's compromised. And I have a hard time allowing him to swim in Long Pond, especially in the private end, because you do not test that. I tested it, and it was high in coliform. Okay? Now, my next concern is who owns the pond. The public end of the pond is controlled by the town of Wellfleet. They do all the testing and they do the management. The private end of the pond is up to the people who live on the pond. Now, it's my understanding that the state owns the land under the water, and the water is owned by the National Park Service.
So your question is that correct?
Is that correct?
So yes, there are multiple jurisdictions on all of the larger ponds. And, oh, I hope I don't get this wrong, but you're correct. The town manages the beach, the public beach area, and I believe the seashore owns the bottom and the state owns the water.
The other concern I have.
Yeah. May I answer a question? I just texted our, yeah, but I'm just a factoid person tonight. So I texted Hillary Greenberg, our health conservation agent, and no, Wellfleet does not have a fertilizer environmental regulation. However, you have your consciences, okay? Second factoid. What you said, Ms. Rothman, about revetments and armoring on the bayside is really good, but you have to remember that whenever you have a rigid revetment or armoring, there is inevitable, always, erosion on either side of it. It's called scouring. And that is why Wellfleet took away all the riprap, the big granite boulders, at that nodal point that you described beautifully back in the 80s. We removed it because on either side it was getting scooped out. Thank you.
Now, in the green, you're the last.
Okay. I'm Pat Bartlett. I've been coming to Wellfleet for 70 years and have lived on the Cape since 1970. And I have observed multiple changes taking place in Gull Pond. That's where I go. And I swim every day in the pond, except for last week. But I have seen a pristine pond with snow white sand all the way across. This is Gull Pond. Change into a pond full of plants, full of weeds, full of algae, full of pine needles. And my question is, and I've been asking this actually for the past 30 years, why does the park and the town not allow any cutting or trimming of vegetation around the pond? Because aren't you providing nutrient loading into the pond, and that has enhanced the natural succession that would occur, but it's happening much more fast because of all of this organic material vegetation going into the pond.
So I'm actually a little glad you asked that, and to what we talked about earlier with the acidity of the ponds, a lot of the lack of vegetation in our ponds may have been the result of the acidic nature of our ponds. And so what we're seeing in many of our ponds is really the natural state. And so what you may be calling pristine is not actually pristine. Many of the ponds are now, may be considered in their pristine state. Gull Pond certainly is higher in nutrients than some of the other ponds within the seashore. And so we do see some accumulation of algae and a little bit more vegetation in some areas. However, for the most part, what we're seeing is a natural community of shoreline vegetation that reflects what should be there.
So we really want our ponds to fill up and become marshes and fields
The shorelines should
as
have,
fast as possible.
the shorelines should have vegetation on the bottom of the pond as well as vegetation emerging from the pond. That is the natural state.
I would caution people from going away today thinking that if you can limit the nutrient load from plant matter or animal life, that's an alternative to solving the human-induced nutrient enrichment that comes from our land use practices. You will not get a restoration of balanced natural systems until and unless we control our nutrient load. And it's attractive to say, we got geese, we got needles, we got whatever it might be. That's not the core problem. The core problem is human nutrients through septic waste and chemical fertilizers. And that's the simple, painful reality of all this. And ultimately, if you look at life cycles of ponds, they turn into meadows. And what we're dealing with is a rapid, culturally induced acceleration of the aging process of our resources. And they will gradually fill in over time. We're compressing the time that that's happening, and a lot of your discomfort about seeing the changes that you're seeing comes from the fact that we've accelerated environmental change through human-induced influences at a rate that goes beyond our ability to process it mentally or emotionally, and for the natural world to adjust to the changes that are happening. And that's a big problem we have to confront as a society that we're nowhere near dealing with.
And we also do know that these vegetation are taking up a lot of the nutrients that we are adding to our ponds and preserving the water quality and clarity in our ponds in a major way, and really saving us from seeing our true impacts.
So I want to thank you all for coming. Our speakers will be here for a few more minutes. If you have follow-up questions, please write us at the website or go to the Facebook page. We will try to respond to as much of it as we possibly can. And thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.